First up at number 10, we have the passenger pigeon. Now these wild birds lived in huge numbers in North America. When Europeans arrived, there was thought to be about 4 billion passenger pigeons on the continent. Now to put that in perspective, there was about 500 million humans alive at the time. That meant these pigeons outnumbered humans about 8 to 1. What? They would swarm in the air in groups of about a mile wide, and people said it actually took hours for a flock to pass overhead. But they lived in forests that the settlers chopped down for farmland. When they tried to eat the grain from this new farmland, the hunt was on. There were no laws about how many pigeons a farmer could kill, and the killing during the 19th century was crazy. It was just a slaughter. By the time conservation laws came in, it was already way too late. Martha, the last passenger pigeon in existence, died in a zoo in 1914. That one is just depressing. Now though, for our number 9, it's the Caribbean monk seal. As the name suggests, this monk seal was found in the Caribbean, unlike its relatives that you usually find in much colder climates. As with the passenger pigeon, contact with European settlers during the 17th century spelled doom for this monk seal. They were hunted for their oils and also because they were competition for fishermen. One of the problems was they just weren't scared of humans at all. They never tried to run because they never had a reason to throughout the course of their evolution. Now all of these factors led to the point where the last one was spotted in 1952, and scientists think they were totally extinct by 1960. 7 years later, the animal was placed on the endangered species list. Yeah, I think you're a little bit too late for that. Coming in at number 8 now, we have the Pyrenean ibex, otherwise known as the becado. Now these wild goats were once common among most of Spain and Portugal for thousands and thousands of years. At one point there was thought to be about 50,000 of these majestic bighorn creatures roaming around the hills and mountains there. Eventually though, after hundreds of years of being hunted and having to compete with domestic animals, the Pyrenean ibex numbers began to dwindle. Conservation efforts made by the Spanish government were too little too late. A management plan wasn't even made until 1993, when just 10 of the animals remained. Celia, the last wild Pyrenean ibex, was found dead on January 6, 2000 after she had been killed by a falling tree. The species was declared extinct. Now scientists did manage to clone a female ibex in 2009, but it only lived for a few minutes. Okay, moving on now to our number 7, we've got the Tasmanian tiger. Now despite looking like a cross between a tiger and a dog, this animal is not closely related to either of them. It actually belongs to the marsupial family, the one that includes the kangaroo, and like them, it carried its young in a pouch. There are actually cave paintings in Australia going back thousands of years ago with pictures of the Tasmanian tiger on the walls there, which I think is fascinating, but despite their presence there, their numbers slowly dwindled until they could only be found on the island of Tasmania. They started off being quite a rare sight there, but they soon began to hunt farmers' sheep, and the government then started offering rewards for every Tasmanian tiger that was killed. This relentless bounty hunting, along with the loss of habitat and new diseases that were introduced, meant that in 1933 the last confirmed Tasmanian tiger was captured and put in a zoo, where it lived for 3 years before dying from neglect. That's awful. Now there have been a couple of reports out there of wild ones that have been seen, but until an official sighting is actually confirmed, it does look like this incredible creature is gone for good. That one's actually so sad. They were such a cool looking animal. Alright guys, there are thought to be almost 5,000 different species of frog in the world right now, but we've got one that recently went extinct. At number 6, it's the gastric brooding frog. These little guys are, or rather were, incredible. They lived in small areas in northeast Australia and were never found more than a few meters from a river. The females would actually swallow their own fertilized eggs because they could grow and survive in their stomach, because the mother had the ability to switch off her stomach acid to stop herself from digesting the eggs. This fascinated scientists who wanted to study them and learn this whole trick for humans who had stomach ulcers. But somewhere along the line, it seems these little frogs were hit by a devastating disease that completely wiped them out. In fact, the last known sighting of them was in 1981, and despite scientists looking for them ever since then, they've been unsuccessful, and the gastric brooding frog has been declared extinct. Okay, halfway through now. Hopefully this is all a bit more educational than it is depressing. I know it's quite sad. But our number 5 now is the Eskimo curlew. Now these long-beaked birds used to be seen flying in massive flocks from Alaska and Canada way down to Argentina and back again. There used to be millions of them that could be seen across North and South America, but with every migration they made, their numbers kept shrinking due to hunting and destroyed habitats. Hunting these birds was banned though in 1916, but after 1939 there were no more sightings of them in South America at all, and the last official sighting in North America happened in 1962. There have been a few unconfirmed reports of them in the years since then, but many experts are saying don't hold your breath at all, because the chances are there are now no more Eskimo curlews. And for our number 4 now, we have the Baiji dolphin. Now unlike its oceanic cousin, this animal could only be found in Asia's longest river, the Yangtze River. This unique dolphin first appeared in the fossil records about 25 million years ago. There they survived for millions and millions of years, using echolocation to hunt for fish. Local fishermen even called the Baiji the goddess of protection, but it was a familiar story when humans began to disrupt its habitat. These days an estimated 12% of the entire human population lives just along this river. Over the past 50 years, China's growth has meant more fishing, more ships, more pollution, and more dolphin hunting. In the 1950s there were thought to be about 6,000 Baiji dolphins. By 1998, scientists could only find 7. In 2006 they looked again and found none at all, eventually declaring them to be extinct. Next up at number 3 we have the Pinta Island tortoise. Now on the Galapagos Islands there are many different species of giant tortoises. Each one is unique to each one of the islands. One of them was the Pinta Island tortoise. Thanks to tortoise hunting and the introduction of feral goats which destroyed the island's vegetation, the Pinta Island tortoises were thought to be completely wiped out by the mid-20th century. Then on November 1st, 1971, a scientist spotted Lonesome George, the last surviving member of his species. Scientists kept looking, but it really looked like he was actually the last of his kind. They tried mating him with a closely related subspecies, but all the eggs were sterile. Lonesome George died on June 24th, 2012 at the grand old age of, well, nobody's really quite sure, but some people say he was 100. Scientists are still on the lookout for another Pinta Island tortoise, but it's looking increasingly likely that George was the very last one. Okay, coming in at number 2 now, we have the eastern cougar. Now these days, if you are lucky enough in your life to see a cougar in North America, it's probably not going to be the eastern cougar variety. They once roamed large parts of northeastern America up into Canada and hunted white-tailed deer. As American settlements grew in the 1800s, they came into contact with the eastern cougar, and a fight to the death began. You get no prizes for guessing who won that one. The eastern cougars struggled on for about another 100 years. One was spotted and killed in Canada in 1932, and then another in Maine in 1938, and then nothing. They were added to the endangered list in 1973, and then in 2011, 73 years after their last sighting, the eastern cougar was officially declared extinct. And finally at number 1 we have the western black rhino. Now these majestic animals were cousins of the white rhino that you guys might recognize, but they'd always struggled to survive compared to them. It's thought that from 1965 to 1995 about 98% of black rhinos were killed by poachers. They wanted the black rhino horns to sell to Chinese medicine dealers who claim that the horns can cure pretty much every illness under the sun. Spoiler alert, they can't. Now despite conservationists trying to tell people this, the demand for black rhino horns stayed high, so poachers kept poaching. In 1900 there were thought to be 1 million of these rhinos. By 1997, guess how many were left? 10. The last one was actually spotted in 2001, and after 10 years of no sightings, the western black rhino was declared extinct in 2011.
Coming in at number 10, we have Homo heidelbergensis, also known as Heidelberg Man. This extinct human ancestor walked the earth about 600,000 years ago in Africa, parts of Asia, and Europe. They are believed to be the direct ancestors of Neanderthals, and some archaeologists even argue that they are archaic or early Neanderthals. Heidelberg Man was an exceptionally tall ancient man. They hunted and butchered large prey, and may be the first species of Homo to intentionally bury their dead. I wonder what those funerals must have been like. It was like Gloop Herp was a very fast runner, but he wasn't so fast that he didn't get mauled by a saber-toothed tiger. And now let's move on before the same thing happens to all of us. At number 9, we have Homo rudolphinus. This extinct human ancestor is only known through a small number of fossil bone fragments. There have been some debate on whether or not Rudolphinus is the earliest known member of the Homo genus or is a very late member of the Australopithecus genus. Due to the scant nature of the remains, not much is known about the species, but evidence suggests that the brains were proportionately larger than the other earliest members of the Homo genus. These guys were huge eggheads. No wonder they didn't make it for a very long time. I don't think nerds would have fared well before laws were invented. Well, they did have laws back then. It was just who could punchy punch the bestie best. Next up at number 8 is Java Man. This early human was actually made up of 80% coffee, and that's how it got its name. And the reason it went extinct was because it was brewed to death. That's a stupid dad joke. And hopefully you didn't believe that because I just made that up. But this next part is true. In the early 1890s, the tooth and skull cap and thigh bone of an extinct human species were found by a team of archaeologists in East Java. That's what gave this discovery the nickname Java Man. It was a big deal at the time, as the bones at that point were the oldest known hominid ever discovered. It was originally argued by some archaeologists that Java Man was the ancestor of Homo erectus, but there were some who said that it was the so-called missing link between ape and man. Coming in hot at number 7 on this list is Homo denisova. One of the more recent discoveries of an extinct human species was made in the Denisova cave in Siberia as recent as 2008. Only very few remains have been discovered so far, but thanks to advanced DNA analysis, it has been possible to sequence the genome of Homo denisova. It has been possible to show that some people in Tibet have snippets of Denisovian DNA, the same way that some Europeans have tiny percentages of Neanderthal DNA. Coming in at number 6, we're bringing you Pengu Man. He was made out of clay, and his mother beats him with a frying pan, while everyone in his life is extremely volatile. If you don't understand that reference, I feel very sorry for you. Another extinct human found in 2008 was Homo sichuanensis. If you can't say that name, just call him the catchier nickname Pengu Man. I struggle with that every single time. Pengu Man's fossilized mandible was discovered by fishermen working near Pengu Islands off the coast of Taiwan. It is extremely thick and has gigantic teeth, which puzzled scientists for several reasons. They were like, how did a creature that didn't have access to a high-carb diet and squats get so thick? I'm just kidding on that one. They have been able to determine that it was the mandible of a previously unknown species, and that it was probably very similar to Homo erectus, but larger. It has so far not been possible to date this fossil, so they are not sure when the species was alive, but finding this incredibly strange fossil with very little to compare it to, it is clear that it doesn't exist anymore. Thankfully. We are at the halfway point of this list, and for number 5, we are at Menisi Man. Homo georgicus, otherwise known as Menisi Man, is a species of extinct human which has been found in Menisi, Georgia. The species has a very small brain, unlike many of our extinct ancestors. The 5 skulls, which are evidence of Homo georgicus, were discovered in 1991, and since then they've been subject to much debate. They may have been an intermediary between Homo erectus and Homo habilis, but there are some scientists who think their skulls are simply examples of Homo erectus. Despite having small brains, the fossils are associated with a total of 73 tools, which proves that a large brain is not always necessary to use tools. Although I would not want to be around the dude who has a small brain and a bunch of tools. He's either going to do a terrible job fixing your car, or he's going to be rooting around your insides before you have the chance to introduce yourself. Coming in at number 4, we have the Red Deer Cave People, the most recently known archaic human to go extinct. The remains of the Red Deer Cave People have been dated approximately 11,500 years ago, meaning they were still around about 28,500 years after the last pure Neanderthal. Some scientists think the Red Deer Cave People were a hybrid of Homo denisova and modern humans, but attempts to sequence their DNA have not proved successful, so it's currently impossible to say for sure. We're finally down to the top 3 here of the most amazing top 10 list of scary extinct human species, and now we have Homo naledi. Evidence of Homo naledi was unearthed in 2013 in a cave in South Africa by cavers who were able to access a chamber in the Rising Star cave system for the very first time. 30 meters down or 90 198 feet below the surface, it's strewn with thousands of bones which have unique and interesting features, with 1,550 currently excavated and many more remaining in the cave. Some of their features are archaic and resembling specimens from 20 million years ago, but they also have more modern hominid features, and their bones have been dated about 250,000 years ago. It has been concluded that they are not direct ancestors of modern humans. Coming in at number 2 on the list, we have the Hobbit. In 2004, researchers made an announcement that a discovery had been made on the island of Flores, Indonesia. The people on the island had long talked about Ubu Gogo, a race of short-haired hairy men who lived in the caves. Astonishingly, the discovery of stone tools and the remains of a small hominid in the cave on the island seemed to prove the legend right. The official name was Homo floresiensis after the island, but they have become known as the Hobbit. Homo floresiensis was approximately 3.5 feet tall with large feet. The Hobbit had very primitive features and a small brain, like our earliest Australopithecine ancestors, but they were able to use tools and also may have been able to hunt and use fire. Using fire back then must have made you the biggest badass of all time. You could just wave it around and everyone would have thought you were a god, and they would have for sure thought you could just like dance really cool or something like that would go along with the fire. And the moment you've all been waiting for, we are at number 1 on our list, and for number 1 we have the ghost ancestor. A study published in 2019 has shared evidence of yet an undiscovered extinct human ancestor proposed after an AI program determined that there was a ghost population of archaic humans which interbred with modern humans in the distant past. Researchers think the unknown ancestor may have been an offshoot of Homo denisova based on the evidence. With new techniques such as this and advances in fields such as DNA analysis, it is now possible to learn more about extinct species of human than ever before. New species are being discovered and identified with relative frequency, and the earliest discoveries can now be reassessed and analyzed with greater detail. The evidence is pointing not to one unbroken chain of human ancestors, but a rich family tree and a number of offshoots. Exactly how many extinct relatives we have we will probably never know for sure, but with each discovery we are able to add new unique pieces to the puzzle of who we are. But wait, that's not all that we have for you on today's top 10 list, guys. People living today who are in Europe, Asia, and Eurasia have well-defined Neanderthal-derived segments in their genome. These fragments are traces of interbreeding that followed the out-of-Africa human migration dating about 60,000 years ago. They imply that children born with Neanderthal modern human pairings outside of Africa were raised among the modern human and ultimately bred with other humans, explaining how bits of Neanderthal DNA remain in the human genome. The plot thickens. Are previous human species embedded within us somehow? Did we evolve from so-called extinct species that I just presented you with? If you weren't scared listening before, then you might be a little bit scared right now. Coming in at number 10, we have Homo gontingensis. We are starting off with an ancestor that might have had a smaller brain than most of our other predecessors, but it seemed that this creature was quite resourceful. Homo gontingensis was a species that seemed to have the ability to use fire. It's unknown how it learned this skill. Maybe it was passed down from generation to generation, like we do with driving or watching American Idol. The way that scientists are able to make this assumption is from charred bones that were found along with the fossils of Homo gontingensis. This means that this prehistoric man was cooking its meat before it ate it. Imagine you were the first guy to cook food. You bring a girl over for a date and you're like, hey, you want some charred meat? You are for sure getting a second date. However, it seems from this ancestor's teeth that meat wasn't often on the menu. They had large flat teeth which are commonly associated with herbivores. It also seemed that Homo gontingensis lived mostly in trees. It might have come down occasionally to hunt or forage for food, but outside of that, trees are where this creature loved to live. Coming in at number 9, we have Homo ergaster. Moving over to Africa now, there's a reason they call Africa the cradle of civilization. It seems that a lot of our ancestors have come from this place, and this is where a good chunk of Homo ergaster's remains were found. Homo ergaster was a transitional ancestor. It seemed to have a weaker bone structure compared to similar species. This would mean that Homo ergaster had started moving into a lifestyle that was less dominated by physical conflict. There's also a lot of evidence that showed Homo ergaster had a more advanced system of social interaction. I mean, they weren't sharing K-pop songs together, but they were gathering in large groups. Who knows what they could have been doing back then? I think it was probably beatbox battling. That's just my highly educated scientific opinion. You don't have to believe me, but I'm on part 3 of this series, so I think I would know. Coming in at number 8 is Homo sorprenensis. This extinct species is extremely interesting because there's so little known about it. Most of the time when a new species is discovered, there's a series of fossils that can be traced back to the same specimen. Sometimes there's even stone tools and evidence as to what their social system looked like. But with this guy, there's none of that. We don't have any info of this old school dude because the only thing that we found was just one skull. It was discovered back in 1994, and since then there has been no discoveries that could be linked back to this guy. It's a lone ranger. Now, how could a skull be found and there be nothing else? Well, there's a good chance that this bad boy was killed by something, and then the skull was taken to another place and then just chucked on the ground after whatever was carrying it was done with it. It's kind of brutal, but back then skulls would have been ripped off of bodies all the time. It was the Stone Age, baby. People ripped your head off as a prank. Coming in at number 7, we have Homo sapien ildaltu. This might be one of our closest known ancestors that has died off. This dude was walking around 160,000 years ago, and in terms of life on this planet, that's not that long ago. They would have walked upright, and it seemed that most of them lived in northern Africa. The remains of this ancestor were found in Ethiopia. It's unknown why this species wasn't able to make it into the future with us. One of the fossils discovered had the best preserved skull of any extinct human species, so we have been able to learn a lot about the size of this people's brain and their eating habits. The brain was pretty close to the same size as our own, and it seemed like most of our ancestors, it fed primarily on a vegetarian diet. Coming in at number 6, we have Kennewick Man. What makes the discovery of Kennewick Man so interesting is that he's not that old. Now, this means that he is most likely a direct descendant and not an extinct species, but I wanted to include him on the list because I thought it was super cool. Kennewick Man was found off the coast of the Kennewick River in Colombia and holds a lot of similarities to other Native American people. He has similar bone structure, and it's thought that he could have very similar DNA as well. When he was found, some information about his death was very fascinating. He didn't die from a tiger attack or old age. He had a spear lodged in his hip. That's a good way to die. So that means competing tribes in the area were duking it out over rule of land way back then, before we were even drawing lines about which nations belong to which people. It really makes you think about how long we've been fighting for, and how in some ways it's built into our DNA. Coming in at number 5 are Australopithecus ramidus. These guys play a very important role in understanding where we come from. Better known as Artie, these are some of the oldest known fossils that can be related to humans. This dude was most likely still covered head to toe in hair like a chimp. Now we would think that is super gross, but back then it was quite stylish. You were warm and comfy all the time. It was like having a free snuggie. They walked the earth about 4.5 million years ago in northern Africa. It's thought that the largest grouping of them would be in present-day Ethiopia. Now, why is Artie so important to knowing more about our genome? Well, because Artie was around at a pivotal moment in our development. 4.5 million years ago was when we were going through a transfer period, when we were going from walking around like an ape to sometimes on 2 legs. The question is, why did we change? Coming in at number 4 with Paranthropus boyacei. Now let's get a little closer to the modern age. Not that close though. This long lost ancestor was around 1.4 million years ago and was found throughout northern Africa. It's thought that they could have been one of the most dominant versions of humanoid for nearly 1 million years. That's not that bad of a track record. Hopefully we can pull off something similar. Something quite interesting about this ancestor is the mouth, jaw, and teeth, because they were freaking huge compared to a lot of other primates of that time. It's thought that they had a high-fat diet that consisted of nuts and hard shells. That is how they got the nickname Nutcracker. This species would use its strong jaws to crack open nut cases that other creatures couldn't get to. Being able to get to high-calorie foods might be why this ancestor was able to be so dominant for so long. Coming in at number 3, we have Sahelanthropus chidensis. Now we are going back in time. This species is a common ancestor for both chimpanzees and humans. It's estimated that this beast walked the earth about 7 million years ago, and it was at this point where our 2 species split. It would have been 2 separate groups of primates breaking off that made our 2 separate species. I think we got the better deal out of this split. Now, why did our species do so much better than chimpanzees? Well, it could have been nutrition or crossbreeding with other ancient species, but the story is still yet to be told. Coming at number 2 is Australopithecus garhi. Alright, we're nearly at number 1, and this guy has locked down the number 2 spot because A. garhi was the first known pre-Homo species to use stone tools. That's absolutely incredible. It's thought that they were not primarily used for hunting or combat, but mostly for butchering meat that had already been killed. They most likely walked the earth 2.5 million years ago. They had huge jaws and heads, but brains that weren't much larger than any other Australopithecus that could have existed around that time. It seems that the females of these species were quite large, which could mean that the males and females were the same size. Coming in at number 1 is Australopithecus afarensis. Probably one of the best studied ancestors. The key to unlocking more knowledge about these dead species is fossils, and A. afarensis is one of the species that we have the most fossils of. Through modern discoveries, we have been able to determine that these males were much larger than the females, and there was most likely a constant battle for dominance between males. They competed for land and mates. The females most likely gathered foods for their prehistoric tribes. It's fascinating what we have been able to discover, and when I say we, I mean people much smarter than me who can pronounce big science words. I'm just the messenger who read a few things on the internet.